Snow doesn't purify anything. It just buries the rot until spring. Helen knew this. She was 72, nursing watered-down scotch in a dead Montana town, waiting for the storm to finally snap her power lines. Then a bleeding fist, wrapped in frozen leather, pounded against her front door. Helen sat in the dark. The floor furnace had quit an hour ago, emitting a final, metallic death rattle that left the cramped living room smelling of singed dust and ozone. Outside, the blizzard wasn't howling, it was screaming. It was a flat, mechanical shriek of wind tearing across the plains, violently slamming into the aluminum siding of her single-story house. She didn't pray. She didn't knit. She just sat in her worn floral recliner, wearing 3 wool cardigans, feeling the dull, rhythmic throb of arthritis grinding in her left knee. The television was a black, static mirror reflecting the tip of her Pall Mall cigarette, glowing orange, fading, glowing again. The house was freezing fast. Frost was already creeping up the inside of the single-pane windows, crystallizing in sharp, fractal patterns over the glass. Helen was a woman who had outlived her patience for the world. Her neighbors were strangers she actively avoided. Her son hadn't called in 4 years, not since the bitter argument over selling the house, and she preferred it that way. Silence was predictable. People were a liability. Then came the noise. It wasn't the wind. It was a heavy, irregular thudding. Meat and bone hitting wood. Helen froze, the cigarette suspended halfway to her lips. Smoke curled up into her eyes, stinging her corneas. She blinked it away. Another thud. Slower this time. Weaker. She considered ignoring it. Whoever was stupid enough to be out in 20 below weather deserved what the ice gave them. But the relentless rhythm of the knocking gnawed at her. She crushed the cigarette into a glass ashtray, the ember hissing against the damp residue of spilled scotch. Pushing herself up out of the chair required a sharp intake of breath. Her joints popped. She limped to the fireplace, her slippers dragging softly against the frayed carpet, and picked up a heavy, wrought iron fire poker. It was cold and reassuringly dense in her liver-spotted hand. Helen shuffled to the front entryway. The air here was 10 degrees colder, seeping under the door threshold like invisible water. She didn't bother looking through the peephole. It was frosted over anyway. She unlatched the deadbolt. The wind didn't just push the door open, it ripped it from her grasp. A wall of blinding white snow blasted into the hallway, bringing with it a man who simply fell inward like a felled tree. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor with a heavy, wet thud, taking a coat rack down with him. Helen stumbled back, raising the iron poker. The intruder didn't move. He lay face down on her braided rug. "Get up!" Helen barked. Her voice was raspy, ruined by decades of cheap tobacco. Nothing. Just the manic roar of the storm pouring through the open doorway, instantly chilling the hallway to a sub-zero freeze. Helen swore, a harsh, guttural sound. She dropped the poker and grabbed the edge of the heavy wooden door. It took everything she had, planting her bad knee, leaning her entire slight frame into the wood to force the door shut against the gale. When the latch finally clicked, the sudden quiet in the house was deafening. She turned her attention to the mass on her floor. He was massive, easily 240 pounds. He wore a heavy leather jacket, heavily distressed and entirely encased in a shell of ice. His jeans were frozen solid to his thick boots. Snow melted off him in rapid pools, staining the rug dark brown. Helen crouched beside him, her knees screaming in protest. She grabbed his shoulder and shoved. He groaned, a low, wet sound from the back of his throat, and rolled onto his side. That was when she saw the patch. Covering the back of his leather jacket was the winged death's head, Hell's Angels, Montana. Helen stared at the skull. She knew the reputation. Everyone did. A gang of outlaws, drug runners, and violent men who treated society's laws like mild suggestions. She looked from the patch to the man's face. He was maybe 40. His beard was a solid block of ice, fusing his chin to the collar of his jacket. A deep, jagged laceration crossed his forehead, the blood having frozen in thick, blackish streaks down the side of his face. He smelled terrible, a pungent cocktail of stale gasoline, wet animal hide, cheap whiskey, and copper. He wasn't moving. If she left him here in the freezing hallway, he would be dead. before dawn. Damn it, Helen muttered. She didn't feel a surge of heroic warmth. She felt profoundly irritated. If he died here, the coroner would have to come. The police would track mud over her floors, and she'd have to answer 100 questions from patronizing deputies. She grabbed him by the thick lapels of his leather jacket. "Wake up, you heavy bastard," she grunted. She pulled. He slid an inch across the slick wood floor. For the next 20 minutes, Helen engaged in a grueling, pathetic war of physics. She couldn't lift him, so she dragged him, agonizing inch by agonizing inch, from the freezing entryway into the slightly warmer living room. Sweat broke out on her forehead, cold and clammy. Her breath came in short, ragged wheezes. By the time she managed to haul him onto the rug in front of the dead floor furnace, her chest felt like it was wrapped in tight iron bands. She collapsed into her recliner, clutching her chest, waiting for a heart attack. When it didn't come, she looked down at the biker. "You're making a mess," she told his unconscious body. The house had dropped to 40 degrees. The only light came from a heavy-duty camping lantern Helen had placed on the coffee table. It cast harsh, elongated shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Helen sat on the edge of the coffee table, a pair of rusted gardening shears in her hands. She had managed to pry the biker's frozen boots off a task that nearly dislocated her shoulder, but his leather gloves were fused to his skin by ice and frozen blood. She didn't hesitate. She wedged the blunt blade of the shears under the cuff of the thick leather and cut. The leather resisted, but she sawed through it, peeling the material back like the rind of a rotten fruit. His hands were a horrifying tapestry of white and bruised purple. Frostbite. It was setting in deep. She fetched a bowl of lukewarm water from the kitchen. The tap was barely running, threatening to freeze in the pipes, and submerged his hands in it. The moment the water touched his skin, the biker's eyes snapped open. They were pale, violent blue. In a fraction of a second, he went from dead weight to a coiled spring. His left hand shot out, dripping wet, and closed around Helen's wrist like a vice. Helen didn't scream. She didn't drop the shears. She simply froze, staring down into the face of a man who looked like he had killed people for far less than touching him while he slept. "Where am I?" His voice sounded like rocks grinding together at the bottom of a dry well. "Let go of my wrist," Helen said, her tone completely flat, "or I'll stick these shears into your carotid artery." He blinked. The fog of hypothermia and concussion slowly parted, replaced by a dull confusion. He looked at her, a frail, 72-year-old woman in 3 cardigans, holding rusty gardening scissors, and slowly released his grip. He tried to sit up, but a violent shiver racked his massive frame. His teeth chattered so hard Helen could hear them clicking. He slumped back onto the rug, closing his eyes. "Bike went down," he muttered, almost to himself. "Hit a patch of black ice on the ridge. Tossed me. Walked. I don't know. 3 miles. You're an idiot for riding a motorcycle in late November," Helen said. She stood up, rubbing her wrist where his fingers had left pale, red indentations. "I'm making coffee." Instant. "Don't complain." When she returned from the kitchen 10 minutes later, carrying 2 chipped mugs of dark, bitter liquid, he had managed to prop himself up against the base of her sofa. He was still shivering violently, hugging his knees to his chest. He looked less like a terrifying outlaw and more like a massive, beaten stray dog. She handed him a mug. He took it with trembling hands, spilling drops of hot coffee onto his damp jeans. "Thanks," he grated out. "I'm Dutch." Helen. She sat back in her recliner, pulling a quilt over her lap. She lit another Pall Mall. The sulfur of the match cut through the smell of his wet leather. "You got a phone, Helen?" Dutch asked, taking a painful sip of the scalding coffee. "Lines have been down since 3 o'clock, she said. "Even if they weren't, no one is driving a tow truck up that road tonight. You're stuck." Dutch looked around the dim, freezing room. He noted the dead furnace, the frost on the windows, the solitary recliner. He noticed the complete lack of photographs on the walls, just faded rectangular spots where frames used to hang. "You live out here all alone?" he asked. "What's it to you?" she snapped back, exhaling a plume of smoke. "You planning to rob me?" Dutch let out a short, rough laugh that turned into a wet cough. He clutched his ribs, wincing. "Lady, I don't think you got anything worth stealing. Good. Then we understand each other. Silence settled between them, underscored by the relentless howling of the wind outside. It was an uncomfortable quiet. Two people fundamentally accustomed to hostility, trapped in a shrinking perimeter of survival. Your head's still bleeding, Helen observed, pointing her cigarette at him. Dutch reached up, his numb fingers brushing the gash on his forehead. It was sluggish, but still oozing. I've had worse. I'm not cleaning your blood out of my rug, she said. She stood up again, muttering under her breath about the endless chores of the living. She went to the bathroom and came back with a roll of gauze, a bottle of rubbing alcohol, and some medical tape. She tossed them onto his lap. Clean it. I'm not a nurse. Dutch looked at the supplies, then up at her. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of his mouth, beneath the thawing beard. You've got a terrible bedside manner, Helen, and you smell like a dead animal. He uncapped the alcohol with his teeth and poured it directly onto a wad of gauze. He hissed sharply as he pressed it to his forehead. Helen watched him from her chair, her expression impassive. But beneath the stoic exterior, a strange contradiction was warring inside her. She hated this. She hated the disruption, the dirt, the sheer physical space he occupied in her meticulously empty life. Yet, as the temperature in the room continued to drop, as her own breath began to plume in the air, she felt a profound, shameful relief that she wasn't dying in the dark alone. I have a son, Helen said suddenly. She hadn't meant to speak. The words just slipped out, pushed up by the oppressive silence. Dutch stopped taping the gauze to his head. He looked at her, his pale eyes catching the lantern light. Yeah? He around? No. Helen looked away, staring at the frosted window. He lives in Seattle, sells commercial real estate, wears suits. We don't speak. Why not? Because I told him his wife was a shallow, grasping idiot who only wanted his commission checks, Helen said, her voice hard, entirely devoid of regret. And he told me I was a bitter old bat who was going to die alone. Dutch processed this. He finished taping his forehead and leaned back heavily against the sofa. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't tell her she was wrong, or that things would work out. Sounds like you're both right, Dutch said bluntly. Helen looked sharply at him, ready to snap back. But when she met his gaze, she saw no judgment. Just the cold, pragmatic assessment of a man who dealt exclusively in hard truths. Slowly, the tension drained out of her shoulders. A dry, humorless chuckle rattled in her throat. Yeah, Helen said softly, taking a long drag of her cigarette. We usually are. They sat together as the temperature plummeted, drinking terrible coffee in the freezing dark. They didn't talk much after that. They just watched the lantern burn down, listening to the wind try to tear the roof off. Two hard edges in a soft world, waiting for the dawn. Midnight brought a cold that stopped feeling like a temperature and started feeling like teeth. It chewed at the extremities, gnawing through wool and leather, settling deep into the marrow. Helen's breathing grew shallow. Each inhalation felt like inhaling crushed glass. The camping lantern had flickered out an hour ago, leaving the room illuminated only by the faint, blue-white ambient glow of the blizzard pressing against the frosted glass. Dutch hadn't moved from the floor, but she could hear the uneven rattle of his chest. His violent shivering had stopped. That was worse. Helen knew enough about hypothermia to know that when the body stopped fighting, the end was negotiating its final terms. Dutch, she rasped. Her voice barely carried over the wind. He didn't answer. She kicked his heavy boot with her slippered foot. Hey, don't die on my rug. I told you. A low groan vibrated from the dark mass on the floor. Not dying, he slurred. Just resting my eyes. Get up! Helen gripped the arms of her recliner, forcing herself to stand. Her knees buckled, but she caught herself against the coffee table. We need a fire. Furnace is dead, Dutch mumbled. I have a fireplace. No wood. I have a dining set. That got his attention. Dutch slowly levered himself up, resting his weight on his forearms. He peered at her through the gloom, the whites of his pale eyes catching the faint snowlight. You want to burn your furniture? It's either the chairs or us, and I'm not flammable enough, Helen said. She pointed a trembling finger toward the archway leading to the small dining alcove. Mahogany, ugly as sin. My late husband bought it to impress his boss in 1978. I've hated it for 40 years. Dutch let out a sharp exhale that might have been a laugh if his lips weren't cracked and bleeding. He pulled himself to his feet. He swayed, a massive, broken tower of a man, gripping the wall for balance. Helen watched him limp into the dining room. A moment later, a deafening crack echoed through the house. Dutch had simply lifted one of the heavy, ornate chairs and slammed it down onto the hardwood floor, splintering the backrest. He dragged the broken pieces back into the living room, tossing them onto the cold hearth. He didn't have an axe, so he used the iron fire poker and the heel of his boot, stomping the wood into kindling. It was a brutal, ugly display of brute force, driven by the desperate adrenaline of a freezing man. He found a stack of old newspapers under the coffee table, balled them up, and struck a match. The fire caught. It was a filthy, toxic fire. The decades-old varnish boiled and blistered, filling the room with the acrid, chemical stench of burning polyurethane. It smelled like burning tires and cheap perfume, coating the back of Helen's throat with a bitter residue. But it produced heat. Helen dragged her recliner closer to the hearth. Dutch slumped on the floor beside her, holding his bruised, purple hands inches from the flames. Toxic, Dutch muttered, coughing up a wad of thick phlegm and spitting it into the fire. It hissed violently. I smoke 2 packs a day, Helen replied, lighting a Pall Mall from the burning leg of the mahogany chair. A little varnish isn't going to tip the scale. They watched the fire eat the ugly chair. The heat was localized, barely pushing the cold back 3 feet, but it was enough to stop the freezing. Why'd you open the door? Dutch asked suddenly. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the flames peel the lacquer off the wood. You're an old lady living alone. You see a giant bastard bleeding on your porch in a blizzard, you're supposed to lock the deadbolt and call the cops. Helen took a slow drag of her cigarette. She looked at her gnarled, arthritic fingers. I was annoyed. Dutch glanced at her, waiting. I was annoyed by the knocking, she continued, her tone flat. And I figured if you died out there, the county would send somebody to drag your body away, and they'd leave my front gate open. I hate when people leave the gate open. Dutch stared at her for a long moment. Then, a genuine, rumbling laugh tore out of his chest, echoing loudly in the cramped room. He laughed until he hacked, clutching his injured ribs. You're a mean old bitch, Helen, he said, wiping a tear of exertion from his eye. And you're a thug who doesn't know how to check the weather report. Fair. Dutch reached into the inner pocket of his leather jacket and pulled out a battered silver flask. He unscrewed the cap and took a swig, then wiped the rim with his thumb and offered it to Helen. She looked at the flask, then at his frostbitten fingers. She took it. It was cheap, burning whiskey. It tasted like gasoline and fire. She swallowed it without coughing and handed it back. My club, Dutch said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the rough humor. They're probably out looking for me, but they won't make it up the ridge until the plows come. Hell's Angels, Helen stated. It wasn't a question. Yeah. You kill people? She asked, bluntly. Dutch looked back at the fire. I protect my own. Must be nice. Having people to protect. Dutch caught the bitter edge in her voice. Your boy. The one in Seattle. He never comes around? Greg. Helen said the name like it was a bad taste in her mouth. No. I didn't go to his wedding. He didn't come to my husband's funeral. We have a very efficient arrangement. We pretend the other doesn't exist, and it saves us both a fortune in holiday cards. Blood don't mean much, Dutch murmured. He tapped the winged skull patch on his chest. These guys, they're not blood, but if I called them right now and said I was in a jam, 100 of them would ride into a brick wall for me. Family is the people who show up when the furnace breaks. Helen didn't answer. She just watched the fire turn the mahogany into white ash. She felt a strange, tight knot in her chest. Not from her failing heart, but from a sudden, stark realization. This bleeding, crude outlaw smelling of sweat and whiskey had given her more honest conversation in 3 hours than her own flesh and blood had in 3 decades. Dawn broke like a dirty gray smudge against the windows. The wind had finally died, leaving behind a silence so absolute it rang in the ears. By 9 a.m., The distant, grinding roar of a snowplow echoed up the mountain road, followed shortly by the guttural idle of a heavily modified 4x4 truck. Dutch stood up. He looked terrible. His face was a canvas of purple and black bruises. His hands were swollen tight, and he leaned heavily to his right. But he was alive. Helen stayed in her chair. The cold and the smoke had taken a heavy toll. Her lungs rattled with every breath, and she looked smaller, frailer, like a bird with hollow bones. Dutch walked to the front door, pulling it open. The blinding glare of the morning sun on the fresh snow flooded the hallway. Two massive men in heavy coats and club patches piled out of the truck, shouting Dutch's name. Dutch held up a hand, silencing them. He turned back to Helen. He didn't offer a dramatic goodbye. He didn't thank her profusely. He walked back to her recliner, reached into his pocket, and pulled out the silver flask. He set it on the coffee table next to her ashtray. "Keep the gate closed," Dutch said. "Don't wreck on my mountain again," Helen wheezed. He gave her a single, sharp nod, turned, and walked out into the blinding white. 14 months later, the ground was hard, unyielding clay, slick with a freezing November drizzle. Helen was dead. It wasn't a heart attack. It was a slow, agonizing slide into pneumonia, a residual gift from the smoke inhalation and deep cold of the previous winter. She had died exactly as she lived, stubbornly, bitterly, and entirely alone in a sterile county hospital bed. The funeral was a pathetic affair. Greg stood near the open grave, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He wore a tailored wool overcoat that cost more than Helen's car. Beside him stood his wife, Brenda, looking irritated that the mud was ruining her designer heels. There were no friends, no neighbors, just Greg, Brenda, a bored funeral director checking his watch, and a priest who kept mispronouncing Helen's last name. "We gather here to commit Helen, Garrison, to the earth," the priest droned, adjusting his collar against the damp chill. Greg checked his phone. He had a flight back to Seattle in 3 hours. He just wanted to sign the papers, list the decaying house on the market, and wash his hands of this suffocating Montana town forever. He felt no grief, only a vague, heavy annoyance at the inconvenience of mortality. "She was a woman of quiet resilience," the priest continued, clearly reading from a generic, pre-written script. Then, the ground vibrated. It started as a low, sub-audible hum that rippled through the puddles resting on the muddy grass. Brenda frowned, looking around. "Is that an earthquake?" The hum deepened into a growl. Then, it broke over the crest of the cemetery hill like a tidal wave of mechanical thunder. The priest stopped mid-sentence. Greg's mouth fell open. Coming through the wrought iron gates of the quiet rural cemetery was a column of motorcycles. They were massive, heavily chromed Harley-Davidsons, their exhausts barking and spitting in perfect deafening unison. There weren't 10 of them. There weren't 50. There were hundreds. The procession stretched down the road as far as the eye could see, a miles-long snake of roaring iron and leather. They rode in tight, disciplined formation, 2 by 2. The sheer volume of the engines was a physical force, pressing against the chest, drowning out the wind, the rain, and every other sound in the world. They flooded the narrow cemetery roads. They parked on the grass. They shut off their engines in waves, the sudden silence rolling forward until the only sounds were the ticking of cooling exhaust pipes and the heavy crunch of boots on gravel. 500 men dismounted. They were massive, bearded, tattooed men wearing denim and heavy leather, and on the back of every single jacket was the winged death's head. Greg took a terrified step back, grabbing his wife's arm. "What the hell is this?" he hissed. "Did you give the cemetery the right plot number?" The crowd of outlaws parted. Walking down the center aisle of leather and denim was a man the size of a doorframe. His beard was neat, but a thick, jagged white scar cut across his forehead, disappearing into his hairline. He walked with a slight, permanent limp in his right leg. Dutch stopped at the edge of the open grave. He ignored the priest. He ignored Greg, not even granting him a passing glance. He looked down at the cheap, veneer coffin, waiting to be lowered into the mud. The silence among the 500 men was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating respect. Dutch reached into his leather vest. He didn't pull out a flower. He pulled out a crumpled, half-empty pack of Pall Mall cigarettes and a cheap plastic lighter. He placed them gently on the lid of the casket. Then he took off his leather glove, revealing a hand marred by the pale, mottled scars of severe frostbite. He placed his bare hand flat against the cold wood of the coffin. "You kept the gate closed, Helen," Dutch said. His rough, gravelly voice carried clearly in the damp air. "Rest easy." Dutch stepped back. He looked directly at Greg for the first time. Greg shrank back under the weight of those pale, violent blue eyes. The look Dutch gave him was one of utter, dismissive contempt. It communicated, without a single word, that Greg was a tourist at his own mother's burial, and he was profoundly unwelcome. Dutch turned and nodded to the crowd. 500 right fists rose into the air, a silent, synchronized salute from men who bowed to no one. Then, as quickly as they had arrived, they turned. Boots crunched on gravel. Ignitions engaged. The deafening, earth-shaking roar returned, rattling the fillings in Greg's teeth. The air filled with the sharp, acrid smell of exhaust and burning oil, a smell Helen would have loved. Greg stood in the mud, clutching his expensive coat, entirely forgotten. He watched the miles-long procession of outlaws ride away, leaving him alone with the crushing realization that his bitter, isolated mother was deeply respected by an army, while he was just a stranger in a suit. If this story of unlikely loyalty and fierce respect moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button to show your support. Share it with someone who understands that true family isn't always bound by blood. And subscribe to our channel for more raw, deeply human stories. Drop a comment below. Would you have opened the door for a stranger in the storm? Let us know, and turn on notifications so you never miss a video.